Hello, this is a fracture tool tutorial for UDK, the May 2011 edition. I'm Barrett Hudson. I'm a student at the Guildhall at SMU in cohort 16, and today is June 4th, 2011. Got a basic play space here, just a hollow box with some lights in it that we're using for our tutorial. So let's go ahead and get started. Now the first thing you want to do if you want to use the fracture tool to create a destroyable static is you need to find the static mesh that you want to make fracturable. So we'll do this by opening the content browser, and I know for this tutorial we're going to use a roof piece called 180 that has 182A in it. So I'll search for that, and here we go. Here's the static mesh I want to use. So once we have found our static mesh, the next thing to do is to click on it, double click on it that is, and this brings up our static mesh editor. There's lots of different things we can do in here, but the important thing for right now is to go up here to the fracture tool, which can either be located by clicking on this icon that says fracture tool, or going to the tools pull down and selecting fracture tool. Either way, we'll bring up this little tool called the fracture tool. And this is what's used to create static meshes like this one that can be broken apart and break up into chunks. So the steps to do this, the first thing we need to do is tell it how many chunks we want to create. We do that with this num chunks slider bar here. It goes from 1 to 150. And we'll go ahead and set it somewhere around 25 for the time being. You can go higher than that if you like, although if you create lots of objects that separate into mini chunks, it does create lots of small geometry when they break apart, which can cause performance issues. So we'll go ahead and just leave it at 25 for the time being, and we'll click generate, and we see these boxes start to appear. And these are the chunks that our static mesh is going to break into. There's a lot in the middle there, and we won't worry about that. Basically what these do are tell the editor where it should slice when we go ahead and break this into chunks, and so it's not going to affect our collision bounds or anything like that, all those chunks are in the middle. But we do seem to have some problems. It looks like we have some chunks that are running all the way from the bottom of the legs up to the top, and kind of like to have the legs separate from the top. So to do that, we need to change our chunk shape here in our fracture tool, and we have what's called plane bias. Essentially this gives the sort of random chunks a bias to a certain plane, and we've got our X, Y, and Z planes here, and we want to give it a Z plane bias such that it's less likely to form very long cuts in the Z plane. We'll do that by increasing this value to 10, and if we press enter, we can see now that we seem to have a lot more horizontal cuts and not quite so many long vertical cuts, which gives us more nice pieces here in our legs that are separate from our chunks in our roof. So that's looking a little better. The next thing below that is we have this modify points, which allows you to shift around where your chunks are. And so right here, I'd kind of like it if that bottom chunk wasn't quite so tall, right here. So we'll go ahead and, in our Z, put in a modify of 10 in the Z axis, and say randomize. And you can see my points sort of start to move around. And so we'll just click this a few times. We're not getting the movement we want, so we'll go ahead and increase this value. Say randomize, and we just got to play around with it a little bit until we get something that we like the look of. Just keep playing with it, and there we go. We've got that leg separated out, and our other legs are looking pretty good. So I like the shape of those chunks well enough, and we're ready to move on. So the next thing in our list here is the chunk options. And as you can see, these are grayed out for the time being, and that's because I haven't actually selected a chunk to apply the options to. To select a chunk, you just left click on it in the viewport here, and you can see that it's selected a chunk and highlighted it in yellow. If you notice, it's kind of hard to select a particular chunk. I'm clicking on these and I'm not getting exactly the one I want, which can make things difficult, particularly when you want to use this feature right here called support chunk. And this is an important thing for any fracturable static, because support chunks basically tell the engine what chunks the object relies upon to stand up, which in this case would be our legs. And if we zoom out here a little bit, we can see more of our object. And we have all of these legs, and without the legs, we'd like the roof to fall down. We don't want it to stay hanging in midair. And declaring them support chunks will allow us to do that. So we can try to click on all of our legs here by clicking on one and then holding down Control and trying to highlight another chunk. But as you can see, it's not exactly easy. And that's why there's this chunk selection tool down here, which we can use to do things like grow our selection, which just selects other nearby chunks to the one that we have already selected. Shrink selection, which does the opposite, just cuts out chunks on the edges. We can go select top, which just selects the chunks on the top. Or we can go select bottom, which just selects the chunks on the bottom. Finally, there's invert selection, which just selects all chunks not currently selected and deselects all currently selected chunks. So for our purposes, we want to select bottom because that gives us all of our leg pieces, and we want to declare them support chunks so that once we break the legs out from under this thing, the roof will cave in and all the pieces will fracture. What's going to happen is essentially all of these blocks are going to try to draw lines to support chunks, and if at any time one of them cannot draw a line to a support chunk, it will go ahead and fall off, which gives it our simulation a much more realistic feel to it. Now, we got our chunk options set now. And this next section is the viewing section. We won't really cover that too much. It basically allows you just to change how your viewport shows up. You can select to see just specific chunks or show cuts, different things like that. And you can play around with it, although most of the time you don't really need to do much of that. And core we won't get into. It essentially allows you to add a core object, a core static to your fracturable object if you want something to be inside of it. What we do want to do is we want to go ahead and say slice here in our tutorial, and this will bring up this save menu. It's like you're creating a copy of your new static, which is in fact what we're doing here. When you fracture something, it takes the static you have and creates a new version of it that has all the fracture data, and it labels it fractured. This is a handy naming convention because that way anytime you're looking for your fractured statics, you can just search for fractured in the content browser and they'll all be in one place. So we're fine with that name, so we'll just say OK, and it will go ahead and generate our fractured mesh. One thing to note is that if you don't see slice, it's probably because oftentimes when you first open the fracture tool, it looks more like this, which can be somewhat deceiving. All you need to do is grab the bottom edge here and pull it down until you can see everything and you've got slice down there at the bottom. Once you do that once, it should stay that way. If it doesn't, you know how to fix it. You can just pull it down. And now that we've sliced our object and saved out a new fractured object, we can go ahead and close our fracture tool.